I'm outside where the light is better and the sound is better too, but they are roofing a house over that way. I think they're past the noisiest part of their work. There will be birds, but birds are nice. So, chapter 50. Fergus came to get Edward and they are galloping off to join the prince at a house that they call Pinky House. There are horses for everybody now because the English army left them behind. And as they gallop, Fergus says to Edward, because apparently you can have a conversation while you're galloping on horseback, Fergus says to Edward, the prince is very pleased to have Talbot as a prisoner. Talbot is indeed a very important prisoner. As we mentioned in the last chapter, he's one of the best officers among the Redcoats and he's a personal friend of the Elector and the Duke of Cumberland. So Fergus says, has he been telling you how the bells of St. James rings? Not Turn Again Whittington. I find that a bit obscure, but I think what he's saying is he trying to persuade you to turn back to the English side? Fergus, said Waverley with a reproachful look. Nay, I cannot tell what to make of you, answered the chief of Makeeva. You are blown about with every wind of doctrine. Which is perfectly true. I did wonder if they'd noticed that. Fergus says, here we have a victory. The prince is eager to thank you in person. Your behaviour is praised by every living mortal. Our beauties of the White Rose are pulling caps for you. And you are stooping on your horse's neck like a butter woman riding to market, looking as black as a funeral. So Edward says he's sorry that Gardiner died and he's just learned that Everard and Richard were put in jail. And Fergus says, well, fair enough, be sorry for 5 minutes. We can raise bail to get your uncle and your father out. Edward then says, well, actually, they're already free. So Fergus says, well, what on earth are you unhappy about? Which is fair enough. Absolutely fair enough. Edward says nothing else, but he feels that Fergus is being a bit hard-hearted. I don't know if I think he is. I mean, it is a big victory, and Fergus has worked towards this all of his life. I think it's fair enough that they're at odds, and if Edward has espoused this cause, which he did, he has sworn allegiance to the prince, he ought to be more pleased. I think that's perfectly true, and they've all lost people here. Edward thinks Fergus is being hard-hearted, and Scott tells us now that Edward had been more than once shocked at the small degree of sympathy which Fergus exhibited for the feelings even of those he loved, if they did not correspond with his own mood at the time, and more especially if they thwarted him while earnest in a favourite pursuit. Fergus sometimes indeed observed that he had offended Waverley, but always intent upon some favourite plan or project of his own, he was never sufficiently aware of the extent or duration of his displeasure, which is somewhat how I saw him, or how I was coming to see him, but I wish Scott had told us this a lot earlier as well. He did give us some indications of it. I mean, right from the start, he said that, for instance, somebody who had time to observe Fergus would see that there was steel under his amicability. He did give us a lot of clues. And the way he felt he could dispose of Flora in marriage as he pleased, that also, I guess, is an indication, but that was a custom of the time, and that is how it worked in France in these days, so that wasn't necessarily anything to do with having empathy. But the way Scott phrases this makes it sound like Fergus is well and truly narcissistic. So they reached the prince. The prince received Waverley with his usual favour, paid him many compliments on his distinguished bravery. His distinguished bravery in leaping before his fellow soldiers to stop them from killing this man. I mean, I guess it was brave. I don't think he had a thought about that at all. And although it happened by a stroke of luck to have been a good move, I feel like the prince should actually be annoyed with him. But I guess since Talbot turns out to be such an important prisoner, they're going to forgive all of Edward's foibles yet again. The prince asks Edward everything he knows about Colonel Talbot, which Edward tells him, and then the prince says, "I cannot but think, Mr. Waverley, that since this gentleman is so particularly connected with Sir Everard, and his lady is of the house of Blandeville, that the colonel's own private sentiments cannot be unfavourable to us." But Edward says, "I'm pretty sure he's solidly on England's side." To which the prince answers, "Well, it's worth making a trial at least. I entrust you with the charge of Colonel Talbot, with power to act concerning him as you think most advisable. And I hope you will find means of ascertaining what are his real dispositions towards our royal father's restoration." Charles is taking such a risk giving Edward this responsibility with an important prisoner, the most important prisoner they have. Such a risk. Edward bows and says, "I'm convinced that if Talbot chooses to come to our side, it may be securely depended upon, but if he refuses, which I think he will, I trust your Royal Highness will devolve on some other person than the nephew of his friend the task of laying him under the necessary restraint." And that's an interesting thing for him to say too, because what he's saying is that you can trust the Colonel's word. If he comes over to our side, he will genuinely be here. We can trust this man, which is what he can't do himself. So how is it that he can perceive of this in others and not in himself? How can he not see that he is failing to do this thing that he is presenting as such a laudable thing in Talbot? At any point now, he doesn't seem to be tempted to return to the British side, even though he was feeling embarrassed that these British generals are viewing him the way they're viewing him. They're disappointed by him, and that is bothering him. But only that, he does seem to feel that he's made the right decision and he's standing by it. So maybe I am being too harsh with Edward here, but no. What he did in that battle, he saved Colonel Talbot and then he tried to save Colonel Gardner. That's not how you fight a war, going in and saving the enemy generals. What he said at the end here was that he's happy to talk to Talbot and see if he can convince him to come to their side, but if Talbot says, "No, there is no way I'm espousing your cause," then he's saying, "I don't want to be the one that has to deal with him then." But the prince says, "I will trust him with no person but you. It is of importance to my service that there should appear to be a good intelligence between you, even if you are unable to gain his confidence in earnest." And okay, so there's politicking going on here that Edward still isn't understanding. The prince wants Edward and Talbot to seem to be close for his own game, whatever that is. The prince then tells Edward that they're all returning to Edinburgh tomorrow, and off Edward goes, back to Talbot. So I'm a bit confused, because wherever this Pinky House is that the prince is at, it's obviously not in the village of Preston, which is where the prisoners are being held. So Edward went back to Preston. I guess that makes sense because they were galloping on horses. It sounds like they've gone a few miles at least. Edward went back to Preston because he has been ordered to stay with Talbot. That means he did not see Tully's boot removing ceremony thing. next page or so is actually just about that, what happened with it. It was put into a formal gazette that the Baron performed this ceremony, and as a result, the Prince has awarded him a boot to be added to his coat of arms. As the highest acknowledged authority in the country, he has the right to amend coats of arms. This is one of those disputed positions, isn't it? But since the Highlanders are on his side, he is the one who can do this. So it is official. The Bradwardine coat of arms will now have a boot put on it. And the Prince promises that once they have taken England and he is on the throne again, he will promote the Baron to a Viscount, which would place him firmly in the aristocracy and actually give him a title. When Edward returns to Preston, Talbot has recovered from the depressed mood he was in. He's no longer saying he'd rather be dead than have witnessed the horrible things he's witnessed and learned the awful things he's learned. He had regained his natural manner, which was that of an English gentleman and soldier, manly, open and generous, but not unsusceptible of prejudice against those of a different country, or who opposed him in political tenets. Edward told him what the Prince would like him to do, and Talbot doesn't agree. He doesn't exactly say no, not completely. He does say that he won't try to escape. Actually, what he says is, "I will not attempt an escape without your knowledge." That's what he says. Talbot says, "I suppose your Chevalier will continue his crusade southward," and Edward says, "Not that I hear. I think the army makes some stay in Edinburgh to collect reinforcements." "And to besiege the castle," said Talbot, smiling sarcastically. Talbot thinks that's not likely to work. "In that case, I think we shall have some time to make up our acquaintance. I guess the Chevalier has a design that I should be your proselyte. And as I wish you to be mine, there cannot be a more fair proposal today." And that's the end of the chapter. So, my thoughts. I think I gave them all throughout. A couple of conversations, a couple of developments. I don't quite understand what it is that the Prince is doing here. It may be a perfectly common political move, but I'm not really grasping it. Edward is his usual self. But it does look to me like he's going to spend some time with Talbot. He's going to be influenced by Talbot because he is so easily influenced by whoever he is with. He seems to just take on their ideas, their notions. It just enters into their plans with the greatest of ease. It just might be that this will break. I don't know if it's a hold. Let's call it a hold. This will break the hold that Fergus has over him. He won't be so influenced by Fergus's hyper-focus on his one goal. But besides that, I still don't really see where we're headed. So, we'll move on to the next chapter. Chapter 51. They all return to Edinburgh. Scott says it's not necessary to record in these pages the triumphant entrance of the Chevalier into Edinburgh, presumably because it's written up in so many other places. Anyway, it was triumphant. They returned. That's, well, I guess all we need to know. The Camerons had entered Edinburgh scarcely 3 hours after the battle, playing their pipes with might and main, and exhibiting with many marks of triumph the colours they had taken from Cope's dragoons. But the return of the main body of the army was reserved for the succeeding day, Sunday, when an attempt was made to impress the citizens with as high an idea as possible of the victory they had achieved. The clans marched in one long extended line into the lower gate of the city, 100 bagpipes playing at once the exulting cavalier air, "The King shall enjoy his own again." They bore, besides their own appropriate standards, those which had been taken from the royal army, and they displayed with equally ostentatious pride the vast accession of dress and personal ornament which they had derived from the vanquished. In the rear of their own body came the prisoners, at least half as numerous as themselves, and then followed the wounded in carts. At the end of all came the baggage and cannon under a strong guard. They paraded through all the principal streets of the city, as if anxious to leave no one unimpressed with the sight of their good fortune. Charles himself did not accompany the procession, but came in the evening to Holyrood House, where, according to the Caledonian Mercury, he was welcomed with the loudest acclamations of the people. One circumstance may be noted. The Highlanders by whom the prince was surrounded in the licence and extravagance of this joyful moment fired their pieces repeatedly. One of these, having been accidentally loaded with ball, the bullet grazed the temple of Flora McKeever, who was standing on a nearby balcony waving her handkerchief. Fergus beheld the accident and was at her side in an instant. On seeing that the wound was trifling, he drew his broadsword with the purpose of rushing down upon the man by whose carelessness she had incurred so much danger. But she caught him by the plaid. "Do not harm the poor fellow," she cried, "but thank God with me that the accident happened to Flora, for had it befallen a Whig, they would have pretended that the shot was fired on purpose." Edward didn't know anything about this because he was accompanying Colonel Talbot, so he was at a very different place in the procession now. And having covered that bit of an entry of the troops into Edinburgh, we're now firmly back with Edward. Edward and Colonel Talbot are both on horseback riding together. They were silent for a while, but that's not Edward's way, I don't think, to ride in silence for very long, so he started conversation. He asked further about Everard and Richard, his uncle and his father. Talbot now seemed desirous to alleviate rather than aggravate his anxiety. So once Edward was assured on that front, Talbot said, "So what about you? How did you get here? What's been going on with you?" And Edward told him the whole story. "And so," said the Colonel, after the whole thing was told, "there has been no malice prepense in this rash step of yours. You have been trepanned into the service of this Italian knight-errant by a few civil speeches from him and one or two of his Highland recruiting agents? It's sadly foolish, but not nearly as bad as I was afraid. However, you can't desert, even from the Pretender at the present moment. With any luck, though, some opportunity may arise through which you can extricate yourself honourably. If this can be managed, I would have you go to a place of safety in Flanders, and I think I can procure your pardon from government after a few months' residence abroad." So there you go. I could not think of any way for Edward to get out of this, but there we have it. If he can get abroad to Flanders, Talbot can smooth his path and get him a pardon. I don't really see how he can get out at this point, but I don't know, Edward is the master of walking away from things and aimlessly finding himself somewhere completely different, so that's probably not so hard for him to achieve. Edward says, "I can't allow you to speak of any plan which turns on me deserting an enterprise in which I may have engaged hastily, but certainly voluntarily." Talbot smiled and said, "Leave me my thoughts and hopes at least. But have you never examined your mysterious packet?" That's the package that Alice put in his portmanteau. "It's in my luggage," replied Edward. "We shall probably find it in Edinburgh." So when they reached Edinburgh, they go to lodgings that were assigned by the prince. Handsome lodgings. Both Edward and Talbot are to stay here. Edward's first thought was to find his portmanteau, and finally he looks at the things that Alice left there, which are a whole heap of letters. The uppermost were two from Colonel Gardiner addressed to himself. The earliest was a kind and gentle remonstrance for neglect of the writer's advice, and a slight warning that soon he would have to call him back, because everybody's leave was likely to be over, because there had been a disaster in Flanders. The second letter, dated 8 days later, was in such a style as might have been expected from the Colonel's receiving no answer to the first. It reminded Edward of his duty as a man of honour, an officer and a Briton, took note of the increasing dissatisfaction of his men. There was trouble in the troops, and that some of them had been heard to hint that their captain encouraged and approved of their mutinous behaviour. That I may be certain, concluded the letter, that this actually reaches you, I dispatch it by Corporal Timms of your troop, with orders to deliver it into your own hand. Now, I didn't mention this before, but when Humphrey Horton was in that hovel dying, he mentioned that Timms had been shot and that was something to do with this mutinous stuff. So it looks like... Anyway, we'll see. Upon reading these letters, Waverley, with great bitterness of feeling, realised that Gardiner must have had every reason to think they came safely to his hand, and that Waverley had deliberately ignored them. And it made it very clear why the letter that Edward did receive was written in the tone that it was written in. The next letter was from the Major of the regiment, acquainting him with a report to the disadvantage of his reputation, stating that one Mr. Falconer of Ballyhopple, or some such name, had proposed in his presence a treasonous toast which he permitted to pass in silence, and asking him to... saying that he hadn't actually broken any laws, but his honour required that the matter be resolved. Obviously, Edward ignored that one too. Edward gave all these letters to Talbot, who read through them, and Talbot said, "What do you think of all this?" Edward says, "Think it renders thought impossible. It's enough to drive me mad." Talbot says, "Be calm, my young friend. Look to this other letter." And the next one is just a scrawl in a different hand for Master W. Ruffin these. "Dear Sir, some of our young gulpins will not bite, though I told them you showed me the squire's own seal, but Timms will deliver you the letters as desired, and tell old Adam he gave them to squire's hand." It's written in vernacular. The gist of this one is that they bought Timms off so that he gave these letters to somebody else, to Will Ruffin. Timms believed that Edward was with this man, so it was as good as giving them to Edward to give them to him. And Talbot says that this Will Ruffin, he's probably your Donald the Bandit. Edward agrees. And there's a few more letters, and they just add more evidence to the plot. Quite fortuitously for the plot, for Edward, one of Waverley's servants shows up here. John Hodges. He was one who had come from Waverley Honour with him. He's not a soldier, he's just a servant. One of the grooms. He now sought out his master with the purpose of again entering his service. And from John Hodges they learned about Wily Will and how he was speaking with the soldiers and the things that he had said, the ways that he had convinced them. It was pretty clear from things he said that he actually had met Edward, because he knew things about Edward that only Edward would have known, or things about Edward and his men that only Edward would have known. It convinced everybody. And Wily Will also told the soldiers that rebellion had already broken out in the Highlands, and that the Highlands were now under the Highlanders' control, under Jacobite control, and Edward was quite senior in that movement, and so he needed them to rebel here. And that's what they did, resulting in Timms being shot and Humphrey being seriously demoted. Scott then jumps in at the end of this chapter and says, yep, everything Edward has figured out is true, but he tells us a little more. He tells us Donald the Bandit's motives. Of an active and intriguing spirit, Donald had been long employed as a subaltern agent and spy by those in the confidence of the Chevalier, to an extent beyond what was suspected even by Fergus McKeever, whom, though obliged to him for protection, he regarded with fear and dislike. To success in this political department he naturally looked, for raising himself by some bold stroke above his present hazardous and precarious state of rapine. Donald even believed that Waverley himself was at bottom in the Stuart interest, which seemed confirmed by his long visit to the Jacobite Baron of Bradwardine, when therefore he came to his cave with one of Glennaquoich's attendants. The robber, who could never appreciate Edward's real motion, which was mere curiosity, was so sanguine as to hope that his own talents were to be employed in some intrigue of consequence. So Donald the Bandit thought that Edward was a very senior official in the Jacobite service, either an officer in the Jacobite army or a very senior spy or a diplomat or something like that. And he was actually hoping when Edward came to his cave that Edward was actually there to see him, pretending to just be a regular tourist so that he could meet up with Donald and pass on some important intelligence, which he then of course failed to do. Donald continued to believe this even after Edward went. Because he realised that Edward wasn't going to tell him anything, he just took the seal because he could see how useful that would be anyway. And he needed to do something because he wanted his own reward. He wanted to rise up in the ranks too. So that's what happens in the next 2 pages of that chapter. By Colonel Talbot's advice, Waverley declined detaining in his service the lad whose evidence had thrown additional light on these intrigues. He represented to him that it would be doing the man an injury to engage him in a desperate undertaking. Waverley therefore wrote a short statement of what had happened to his uncle and his father. Cautioning them not to attempt to answer the letter. Talbot then gave the young man, that's John Hodges the groom, a letter to the commander of one of the English vessels of war cruising in the Firth, requesting him to put the bearer ashore at Berwick, with a pass to proceed to Waverley Honour. So they gave him money, and the groom set off with Edward's letter to his family and another letter authorising his passage. Tired of the attendance of Caleb Beg, who Waverley was starting to realise was actually a spy for Fergus, and it took him long enough. Maybe Talbot put the thought into his head. Anyway, he's realised that Caleb is a spy, so he says, I don't need your services any longer, and he employs a random Edinburgh man. And that's the end of the chapter. So my thoughts on that one. It went smoothly. There was no unnecessary detail. Things are happening. Edward's head is turning back to his former thought patterns, which I guess we knew he would. He's starting to think more like Colonel Talbot because he's a total chameleon, our Edward. He just thinks and believes what whoever he's with thinks and believes. Anyway, good that Caleb Beg has moved off. Probably Fergus won't see that as a good thing, but there's not much he can do about that. And the whole previous plot has been uncovered. We know where we stand. So that is another change. I mean, here we are at page 328, and the first act is completely played out now. We're definitely in a different situation. I think from here on we're moving towards the conclusion.